Conventional war. Conventional war is what most people picture when they think of armed conflict. Two organized military forces representing recognized states meeting each other on defined battlefields with declared objectives and broadly understood rules of engagement. It is the oldest formalized type of warfare and the one that produced the great set-piece battles of history. Waterloo, the Somme, the beaches of Normandy. Each side wears a uniform, operates a chain of command, and targets the other's military capacity rather than its civilian population. What makes conventional war significant is not just its scale, but its structure, the existence of rules, however imperfectly followed, that separate it from simple organized slaughter. The problem is that conventional war between major powers has become increasingly rare, partly because nuclear weapons make direct confrontation between superpowers catastrophically risky, and partly because the wars of the 20th century demonstrated the industrial scale of destruction that conventional conflict between modern states can produce. The two world wars were conventional wars taken to their logical extreme, and the world has spent the decades since trying to avoid repeating the experiment. Guerrilla war. Guerrilla war is the weapon of the outnumbered, and it has humbled some of the most powerful military forces in history. The term comes from the Spanish word for little war, coined during Napoleon's occupation of Spain when Spanish irregular fighters used ambush, sabotage, and rapid withdrawal to bleed French forces who could never quite locate, fix, or destroy an enemy that refused to stand still and fight. The fundamental logic of guerrilla warfare is straightforward. A weaker force cannot defeat a stronger one in direct confrontation, so it avoids direct confrontation entirely. It attacks supply lines, disappears into civilian populations, strikes at isolated units, and makes the cost of occupation gradually unbearable. The Americans encountered it in Vietnam. The Soviets encountered it in Afghanistan. The British encountered it in Ireland, Kenya, Malaya, and a dozen other places across their empire. In almost every case, the conventional military power possessed overwhelming firepower and almost no ability to apply it effectively against an enemy that existed everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Proxy war. Proxy war is what happens when two powers that cannot afford to fight each other directly find a third country to fight in instead. During the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union understood that direct military confrontation carried nuclear risk neither side was willing to accept, so they spent 4 decades funding, arming, training, and advising opposing factions in conflicts across Korea, Vietnam, Angola, Afghanistan, Nicaragua, and numerous other countries, each side advancing its interests through other people's casualties. The civilians caught between proxy forces had no stake in the ideological competition being conducted through their territory, and the devastation visited on those countries frequently outlasted the Cold War by decades. The proxy war did not end with the Soviet Union. The conflicts in Syria, Yemen, and Libya in the 21st century all exhibited clear proxy dynamics, with regional and global powers supplying weapons and political cover to competing factions while insisting they had no direct involvement. The defining characteristic of proxy war is that the people who make the decisions about where and how it is fought are never the ones who die in it. Total war. Total war is the point at which a conflict consumes everything, not just armies, but entire economies, civilian populations, industrial capacity, and the moral frameworks that ordinarily distinguish combatants from non-combatants. The concept emerged fully during the First World War, when the Industrial Revolution's productive capacity was turned entirely toward military output and reached its most complete expression in the Second World War. In a total war, factories become military targets because they produce weapons. Railways become military targets because they move troops. Cities become military targets because they house workers. The distinction between soldier and civilian collapses under the logic that everything supporting the enemy's war effort is a legitimate objective. The firebombing of Dresden, the siege of Leningrad, the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, these were products of total war thinking, in which the suffering of civilian populations was accepted and in some cases deliberately pursued as a tool of strategic pressure. Total war tends to end only when one side's capacity to continue has been so completely destroyed that resistance is no longer physically possible. Cyber war. Cyber war is the newest form of conflict and the one whose full implications are still being understood in real time. It involves using digital tools, malicious code, network intrusion, infrastructure attacks to damage, disable, or manipulate an adversary's systems without firing a single conventional weapon. In 2010, a piece of malware called Stuxnet, widely attributed to American and Israeli intelligence, destroyed approximately 1/5 of Iran's nuclear centrifuges by causing them to spin themselves apart while reporting normal operation to monitoring systems. No bombs were dropped. No soldiers crossed a border. A country's strategic program was set back by years through code. The challenge cyber war presents to existing international law and military doctrine is profound. It is often impossible to attribute attacks with certainty. The line between espionage and warfare is deliberately blurred, and attacks on civilian infrastructure like power grids and water systems can produce humanitarian consequences without any of the legal mechanisms that govern conventional conflict ever being triggered. Every major military power is simultaneously developing offensive cyber capabilities and trying to defend against them in a competition that's largely invisible to the public it most directly affects. Psychological war. Psychological war targets the mind rather than the body, and its practitioners have always understood that a population convinced resistance is futile surrenders more efficiently than one that needs to be physically defeated. The tools have changed dramatically across history, from the deliberate terror campaigns of the Mongol Empire, which spread accounts of what happened to cities that resisted before their armies arrived, to the leaflet drops and radio broadcasts of the Second World War, to the social media operations that now shape political opinion across dozens of countries simultaneously. The goal in every case is the same: alter what the target population believes, and you alter what they are willing to do. Modern psychological operations are conducted by dedicated military units in every major power, operating across digital platforms with capabilities that allow highly targeted messaging to specific demographic groups based on behavioral data. The 2016 American election became the most studied example of psychological warfare conducted through social media, with Russian-linked operations exploiting existing social divisions to amplify conflict and undermine institutional trust. Whether that campaign constituted an act of war is a question that existing legal frameworks have no clean answer for. Civil war. Civil war is uniquely destructive because it tears apart the social fabric that makes any recovery possible. In a conventional war between states, defeat ends the conflict, and reconstruction can begin with a functioning social structure still in place. In a civil war, the people who have been killing each other have to subsequently live together, share institutions, and rebuild a country whose divisions produced the conflict in the first place. The American Civil War killed more Americans than every other conflict the country has fought combined. The Spanish Civil War of the 1930s produced wounds in Spanish society that lasted for generations beyond Franco's death. The Rwandan Civil War of the 1990s killed up to 1 million people in 100 days, and left a country that had to construct entirely new mechanisms of justice and reconciliation simply to function as a society afterward. Civil wars tend to be longer, more brutal, and harder to resolve than interstate conflicts, partly because the grievances driving them are intimate rather than geopolitical, and partly because there is no clear border across which a defeated enemy can retreat. Hybrid war. Hybrid war is the dominant form of conflict in the 21st century, and most governments are still struggling to develop coherent responses to it. It combines conventional military force, irregular warfare, cyber operations, economic pressure, disinformation campaigns, and political manipulation into a single integrated strategy, using each element to amplify the others and create a type of conflict that defies easy categorization. Russia's approach to Ukraine beginning in 2014 became the defining case study, a combination of unmarked military personnel, manufactured political instability, media narratives tailored for different audiences, cyber attacks on infrastructure, and an economic leverage that created a conflict whose nature was being debated at the same time it was being fought. The deliberate ambiguity is the point. Hybrid war is designed to keep the target state off balance, unable to respond with conventional military force because the aggression is packaged in ways that make formal military response legally or politically difficult. It exploits the gap between the speed at which events unfold and the speed at which democratic institutions can formulate and authorize responses, a gap that, in the information age, has become a strategic vulnerability all by itself. If you made it this far, drop a comment below and let us know which type of conflict you want us to break down next. Subscribe so you never miss an upload. There's a lot more where this came from.